Changes to occur in any sphere, which is included in a system, are possible by the influences to be sent to the magnetic field of that sphere. That is, infinite changes needed in a sphere occur through influences to arrive at the magnetic field of that sphere, from the sun of the system or from elsewhere, and these influences are sent directly or indirectly by the beings of the plan of duty who are engaged in that system. If changes in scale of a great revolution are needed upon any sphere, as the ones in the world we have mentioned above, then the need of sending more intense and forceful influences arises. Therefore, let us explain where this strong influence, which will put into effect this great world revolution that will evidently take place, comes from and how it renders its function. The first strong influence which will reach the solar system for this event will come from the magnetic field of a planet, which is almost 400 times that of the Earth, of another system which is at great distances from this system. This planet, while larger than the Earth, which has much simpler and heavy matter than the world, has an accustomed orbit it follows around its own sun, which is quite distant from the solar system. And as it traverses its orbit, it has diverted from the part of its orbit, which coincides with the solar system which the Earth is subject to, and started to advance towards the solar system by making a vast curve. This situation has been realized through the influences continuously sent by a plan, in accordance with the directives coming from the unitary, engaged with the large and small revolutions to occur in many systems, pertaining to this advance. Consequently, upon its great curve this planet will reach a certain point, which is plotted for it, by that sublime plan of duty, close to the solar system, and later, it will change the direction of its advance, that is, its curve back to its own system, and when entering the original orbit of its system, it will continue its accustomed orbit around its own sun. This planet's diverting from its accustomed orbit, and extending its journey in an unusual way with a great semicurving towards the close quarters of the solar system, whilst returning back after a certain point, without colliding with the sun, is of course not a coincidental event, but is a result of a sublime necessity coming from the unitary. This planet has currently left its orbit, and advances towards the direction of the solar system, and gets nearer at each moment. This planet, which is still impossible to observe right now, will be observable with the naked eye from the Earth, 200 years later. Now, let us elaborate on the consequences of this planet's unusual journey. This journey of the planet we mentioned is the necessity of a general evolutionary process which concern many systems. Firstly, this planet itself will encounter and collide with the magnetic fields of many other systems, until it gets closer to the solar system. With each collision, enormous tremors, instabilities, and upheavals will occur on its own structure, and the beings of that planet, which are much simpler and primitive compared to that of our world, will only be able to accelerate their development by means of those enormous convulsions. Secondly, this planet will cause disruptions, in varying degrees in the equilibrium of the many other systems it will encounter, until it reaches the solar system. It will make their states topsy-turvy, and consequently, it will prepare possibilities for the development of many other spheres. Finally, its magnetic field will influence our solar system in the way we will soon explain, and our Earth, which is the most developed sphere of this system, will get into most violent consequences of this influence. Now, we begin to explain the working mechanism of the influences, which cause the emergence of these consequences. Earth does not rotate on its orbit around the Sun in a vertical axis. This axis is tilted at 23 degrees 27 minutes to the vertical position, and it completes its daily cycles by rotating around this direction. At certain places of the world, which rotates under these conditions, for example, at its poles, there are the located and continuous icy regions, and between the poles, an established equatorial climate. The top and bottom points of this axis, assumed in the direction of this tilt, constitute the south and north poles of the world. That is, the points where these poles exist correspond to the two endpoints of the axis the world rotates on. As the world rotates around its own axis, the motions it makes are zero at these points. And this is a result of the state of the general equilibrium that is established within the whole of the world, through innumerable imbalances, occurred through the value differentiation of the magnetic field values in opposing characters, which are constituted by the world parts, in accordance with the duality principle we previously mentioned. Today, this equilibrium, despite it registering more or less slight deviations, is in a stable state. As a result of this situation, the current geographical climates, seasons, and states of day and night are brought about. Now, let us trace the planet which gets near to the solar system. Currently, this planet is at a very great distance from the solar system. Consequently, its magnetic field is not yet in direct contact with the magnetic field of the solar system. However, from the moment this planet, which is 400 times the size of the Earth, has left its orbit, and started to advance towards the solar system, some indirect influences of it have started to affect the solar system. That is, the magnetic field of our solar system, which is in relation with the magnetic fields of other systems, which this planet is now in contact, receives the influences of the aforesaid planet through this way. However, because this planet is still very far away, and its influences arrive through ways involving the intermediaries, its consequences in the solar system are very weak today. Nevertheless, this planet continuously gets closer to the Sun. A moment will come, almost 50 or 60 years later from today, that the magnetic field of this planet will enter a state of direct contact with the magnetic field of the solar system. When this state occurs, the very heavy and dense magnetic field of the planet will make a powerfully oppressing influence over the magnetic field of the Sun. This heavy influence the whole solar system with all its planets receives will put into effect various reactions upon the planets, more correctly, upon their magnetic fields. We said that the influence coming from the Sujana planet is very coarse and heavy. Therefore, because there is an enormous incompatibility between the subtle and complex magnetic field of the Earth, which is the most evolved sphere of the solar system, and the coarse magnetic field of this planet, the most violently convulsive consequences and reactions of the influence coming from the planet to the solar system will be seen in the Earth's sphere. As a result of this situation, the Earth's current stable axial tilt of 23 degrees 27 minutes will increase 13 degrees under the pressure of this coarse magnetic field of the planet, and the axis of the world will be tilted at 36 degrees to its orbital plane. The initial shift of the poles begins, with the Sujana planet's first direct influences to arrive at the solar system. The concept of pressure here should not be taken literally. That is, it should not be thought here as if the world is impacted or bent with a push coming from outside. To explain this, let us first take the motions of a sphere, which rotates around its own axis. This sphere rotates around a straight line called axis, which connects the two stable points we call the poles. The occurrence of the polar points here is the result of the sum of the total equilibria, put into effect by the opposite values in the structure of the sphere, and its magnetic field, that is, by the motions. Motions at the poles are zero. On the other hand, where the motions are most is the belt region, which is the exact middle of the distance between two poles, which we call the equator. So, the mean ratio between the velocities of the motion, which is the most in the equator, and is the least at the poles, is the result and manifestation of the total sum of the motion equilibria in the sphere, as we said. Therefore, when disruption or alteration occurs in these equilibria within the sphere, for any reason, then, the 0 points, in other words, polar points, can be displaced. That is, poles can shift slightly or radically, depending on the intensity of the degree of the equilibrium change, upon the sphere, to the back or forth, left or right, relative to their former locations. And in accordance with the equilibrium principle, the equator immediately changes its position, takes its proper place around the sphere relative to the new poles. Occurrence of this situation means that the sphere which rotates starts to divert from the former rotational direction, in order to rotate in a different direction on the axis which occurred between the new poles. And the thing that will happen in the Earth is the same. After the influences coming from the outside planet to the magnetic field of the Earth, and in turn, into its structure, disrupt the initial equilibrium, by affecting the inner motions of the sphere, these changes in the equilibrium continue on through new states and new motions that start to occur in the Earth, in accordance with the consecutive value differentiation mechanism, up to the boundary, where the equilibrium is to be established completely. As the result of this, the existing north and south poles at the known locations of the Earth shift. Since the poles, as we just mentioned, are the result of the general equilibrium of the sphere, as these are displaced, the equator of the sphere immediately changes its place to take its required location on the surface of the sphere, according to the new situations of the poles. Therefore, the axial direction between the sphere's new poles to occur will start to change after the shifted positions of the poles, relative to its former axial direction. For example, as the Earth's north pole starts to shift, gradually towards the south at the part in Siberia, the south pole will start to shift towards the north, within the same degrees, at the opposite part at the direction where the Cape of South America is located. As the result of this, equator will take its place around the Earth, at same distance from these two new poles, that is, its location will change relative to the poles. In this case, because the Earth always rotates around its own axis between the poles, and this axis is more tilted than the former one, this situation of the Earth displays the scenery, which is a little bit more tilted relative to the former one. Actually, the Earth's sphere has not changed its position. For example, Francis Joseph's land will be at the same place, where it has been in a tilted line, relative to the orbit of the Earth. However, the polar point which has been there, will now be located not there, but much lower relative to this archipelago. Similarly, Tamar Peninsula will also not move an inch from its former locations, relative to the Earth's orbit. However, the former North Pole is above it, but the new North Pole will go partly below this peninsula, and will occur below it. Similarly, in the southern hemisphere, the South Pole is to be arranged according to it. For example, the South Pole, which previously has been at much lower parts of Alexander Island, although this island would not change its place relative to the Earth's orbit, has now shifted to its higher part. So, the direction of the new axis of the Earth, which occurs relative to its new poles, has become slightly more tilted to its former equator, relative to its former axis, and the new equator has changed accordingly, and moved up to a surface vertical to the newly occurred axis. Thus, as a consequence of the disruption of the total motion equilibrium of the world, by the influence coming from the planet, the North Pole will shift south at the Russia side, and the South Pole will move up north, at the direction of the Cape of the South America. Certainly, in accordance with this situation, the oblique degree of the axis, between the newly situated North and South Poles, relative to the former axis of the Earth, will increase, relative to the obliquity degree of the former axis, and this increase will be at an angle of 13 degrees. The locations of these points, in accordance with the current geographical positions are: the new North Pole will shift to a point, where the current polar circle joins with the 100th meridian. And the South Pole will rise up in the direction of the Cape of the South America, and reach the point where the current South Polar Circle joins with the 80th meridian. Naturally, then all meridians and parallels, as well as the equator, will shift, and they will take their places upon the Earth, according to the new poles.